Well, welcome to week 8. This week we're going to be talking about how to talk about values in environmental science problems. We're going to do that by discussing problem types and values, worldviews, and scenarios. And again, we're not trying to evaluate different people's values. We're trying to learn how to bring values into the discussion so that we can use those to enhance our description of the problems and move forward on environmental problems. So the themes for today are that there are patterns of thoughts and values around particular worldviews, that if we understand how values shape these, we can work with that diversity of worldviews, and then we're going to see how we can use scenarios as a tool for considering future options. So first I want to review the problem types we discussed in the first week of class. And there are several problem types, that is easy and information problems, that have a good alignment between costs and values, or a good alignment between individual and community values. Those are simply an easy problem. We know the answer. We could formulate regulations or incentives to reach a good solution. For information problems, we need more research, but everybody agrees on what path we should take. For community rule problems, such as common pool resources, the information is readily available, but there's a poor alignment between individuals and communities, so we have to negotiate this with political or organizational approaches. And for wicked problems, which has been really most of the examples of problems we've dealt with in class, there are information needs, and there's also a misalignment between either the benefit from individuals versus the community, or from different groups of individuals. And in a wicked problem, the information and the values are intertwined, such that as people get more information, it changes their values, and as the values they hold determine what information they're interested in understanding. So a wicked problem is really a weaving values and information together. So we can look at particular approaches to environmental problems, and in this slide I show the problem typology we just talked about from the first week. And I want to introduce this other table right next to it on management strategies. And the roles are the same, sufficient knowledge or uncertainty, but the difference in management strategies is whether we have high control or low control. And you can just think about this. A good example of high control is a small area where if something goes wrong, we could just dig it all up and start over again, versus a low control area might be a large area or ecosystem level problem where there's really no way we can control all of the possible variables as we try to solve the problem. So when we have high control and lots of information, we can use optimal project management, just pretty much impose the regulations and get them to work. When we have a lot of information about the problem but low control, we can use hedging or diversification, because we don't really know what's going to happen. We can choose a portfolio of approaches to try to make sure that some of them work pretty well. And then when there's high control and uncertainty, this is a case where we try to buy down that uncertainty by using some of the control and crafting management approaches that help us reduce uncertainty. And then finally, when there's low control and a lot of uncertainty, this is a case where we would use scenarios to help understand what the future outcomes might look like, and therefore choose a path. Now we're going to, in the next 2 weeks in this course, well, this week we're going to talk about scenarios, and then next week we're going to talk about some variations on hedging and diversification, and the final week we'll talk about scientific adaptive management. So we've talked about 3 major dimensions of these problems and strategies. One is the information that's available, the knowledge. The other is the control, and finally the values, whether the values align. So the knowledge goes from well understood to substantial uncertainty. The control is from the ability to manage a project to really totally unmanageable because of the scope is too large, or there's a lot of complexity in the system. And then finally the values. That goes from where everybody agrees to mismatches between either individuals in society or a disparity in the benefits or costs, where the cost might fall on one particular group and some other group to get the benefits. Now we can represent these all in one table, where here we have knowledge, control, and values. And what we're going to be talking about this week are scenarios and expanded narratives where we have low knowledge, of that it means high uncertainty, low control, and the values are either low or high. They're either total mismatch or there's a match. But the scenarios and narratives can really deal with that situation and help people understand what are the possible outcomes. Then next week we're going to be talking about environmental entrepreneurism, where there's high control. So low knowledge, low value alignment, but high control, so we can address some of the value mismatches and the uncertainty with the market, use environmental market approaches. And then finally, on the last week, we'll be looking back at a lot of the projects that we've discussed and put those in the context of scientific adaptive management. That is, how do we create environmental management projects that actually help us understand the problem better. All right, we're going to start by our discussion of values by talking about worldviews. And worldviews are described by culture theory, where people have particular values they hold. Because of those values, they have certain information that they're likely to accumulate, and they use particular cognitive tools, and all these are reinforcing. So in science, we would hope that we don't express a worldview, because we're trying to look at all values, we're trying to look at all possible solutions, and we try to pick up information that just doesn't reconfirm our bias. But the population of the rest of the world, of citizens and non-scientists that we deal with, very often will have a particular set of values, and because of that, they also think certain ways of analyzing information are better or worse, and then they only accumulate information that really confirms what they already think. And that's called confirmation bias. But another sort of more neutral term about it is that they're trying to understand the world, and they build an understanding based on what they already know. So as they try to make sense of things, they build and make connections to what they already know. So they're going to have a certain bias in what they can learn easily. So let's talk about these different worldviews that are used to describe broad swaths of society, not individuals. As an individual, you might fall into one of these categories, but you could see these trends in an overall society without actually having any individual adhering to the a strict cornucopian description, for example. So these four worldviews. This is one taxonomy of worldviews. I'm going to present another one in just a second. It's very similar. But the cornucopians are optimistic technologists. They think there's going to be a technological fix for everything, and they justify that by looking at history and say every time there's been a problem, humans have been able to solve it. They also believe in very weak sustainability, which is an economic term that means that they think natural capital can be replaced with other forms of capital, such as constructed capital. For example, you could replace a wetland with a sewage treatment plant. And they believe in individual and property rights. So cornucopian is going to be what we talk about in our other taxonomy as individualists. They believe in a free market and technology. Accommodating or industrial ecology are, as a group, believe that efficient technologies and market incentives are going to be the solution to most of our problems. They believe there should be equity for all individuals, that individuals should have access to equal opportunities. And they see they have a utilitarian view of nature, that is, we should use nature for human purposes, and that they think all capital is interconvertible, but they may give a slight deference to natural capital that can't be replaced necessarily just with a sewage treatment plant. Communalists, or committed environmentalists, and accommodating industrial ecologists. This is really sort of a group in the other taxonomy. We're going to call these hierarchists, because they believe that because of efficient technology market incentives, they believe that there are rules that would really help reach those goals. So a communalist or committed environmentalist is a group that believes we should conserve resources, and that means they believe in a strong sustainability, that we can't replace certain aspects of natural capital, wilderness and biodiversity, so we need to preserve it or conserve it. They think we should have a green economy, which means reduce, reuse, recycle, with the emphasis on reducing and reusing and trying to minimize our footprint. And they also think that collective interests take precedence over individual human interests. So what's good for the group is better than what's good just for every individual. And in the other taxonomy, we're going to call these people egalitarians. They believe that we can do the most through sort of communal action and cooperation. And in this taxonomy, we have deep ecology, which is people that really believe that there should be severe limitation on take. You shouldn't use a resource unless you absolutely need to. We should preserve all sorts of natural capital, wilderness, and the broad swaths of undisturbed natural areas. They believe in a broader definition of rights that includes animal and plant and earth systems as also having rights at the same level as human rights. And they believe in a very strong version of sustainability where natural capital and even things that you shouldn't even be talking about it as capital, it just has an inherent right to exist. So I'd like you to just think about which of these worldviews you might most resonates with you. If you had to describe yourself, what most resonates with you in terms of, are you individualists, or are you accommodating industrial ecologist, communalist, or deep ecology? And the key words for these are really here: technology and individual progress. For the cornucopian, accommodating is efficiency and setting the right incentives and rules. A communalist is really the precautionary principle and having the community values and benefits take precedent. And deep ecologist is really a preservationist sort of mindset. Okay, let's look at another taxonomy that we're going to use also in this class. They're very similar, and this one is based on hierarchist, egalitarian, individualist, and it derives from a myth about how nature works, like a deeply held myth that isn't really expressed directly. As people don't wear T-shirts walking around with this on them, but they just sort of think about everything is driven by this understanding. And so for a hierarchist, they think nature is generally robust, and that with the right control and well-structured regulations, humans will be able to operate very effectively on the Earth. Egalitarian believe that nature is essentially fragile, and that we need to prevent impacts. We need to take prudence in the management of that, and use the precautionary principle when we make decisions. And individualists really think that human activity is independent of natural or global activities, and that they see that there's new opportunities that come from the market, and we'd be missing out on that if we didn't take advantage of these natural resources and opportunities. Okay, in this individualist, hierarchy, egalitarian taxonomy, it's not represented on this slide, but there's also fatalists, and fatalists just believe that there's really no reason to try to solve these problems because they're just unsolvable, and so we should work on solutions that protect our current status rather than try to really predict into the future. Okay, now one of the ways we use these values and worldviews is to try to deal with the future, and in this course and in environmental science, we deal with the future as being basically uncertain. And just to define that word a little bit better, risk is when we have a probabilistic estimate of damage. So we might have the probability of an event, the probability of exposure given that event, and the probability of that event and exposure leading to damage, all of those things adding up. And we could calculate those, and we could manage this by decreasing the probability of event or exposure or some sort of damaging contact. Uncertainty is really a lot different concept the way we use it, which is that there's just some stuff we can't know and we don't know, and the sources of that uncertainty are inherent variation in the system itself, just because of the complexity and the diversity of the system, such as like an ecosystem. There's just a lot of variation in there. We might have inadequate methods to observe and monitor those systems. That might be our own perception, or it might be the instruments we use. And finally, there's this idea of volition, or human decisions, that sometimes humans just do crazy stuff that's unpredictable. That is, there's uncertainty in the future. There's a third type of another type of uncertainty, which is indeterminacy, and that's when humans apply too much power or power density per unit area to a system and totally wipe it out, and just sort of like hitting the reset button. It's like just jumping across a chasm and you don't know if there's something on the other side. Just and that's also a type of uncertainty that we actually cause in some of our management activities. Well, so we want to deal with this uncertainty in the future, and we can do that by defining certain futures and what might happen. And I'm going to talk about several examples of that in coming up. And the first is the idea of whether your worldview matches what the future is, and the other is let's just collect some information and make scenarios about what might happen. I'm going to deal with that in the second part of this lecture. So when your worldview either does or doesn't match, that's called a utopia or a dystopia, respectively. So if your world happens to match what the future is, like you thought something, you think this is how the world works, and it actually ends up working that way, that's utopia. And this isn't a sense of being necessarily good. It could be a bad outcome, but you predicted it and you were ready for it. So here's an example. You're an egalitarian and you think everybody should work together, and it turns out that the best solution is that everybody works together and society functions well. A dystopia would be when you predict the future and it just doesn't work out that way. And same sort of example here. Let's say you're an egalitarian and you think everybody should work together, but in your neighborhood there's a bunch of unruly miscreants running around causing ruckus because they're borderline sociopaths. You really need some strong rules and some police to keep them in line. Well, then your society's in trouble, and that's what's called a dystopia. Just things don't work the way you think it should work. Now, if you were a hierarchist and thought everybody should be controlled by strong rules and police and incentives, then that would be a utopia. When people start running around causing a ruckus and the police arrest them and get things back to normal, then that would have been your sort of utopia as a hierarchist. You predicted the future, and that actually came to be. Okay, let's look at two ways of analyzing the future based on uncertainty. So the first is just using a decision square that comes out of really the beginning of game theory. And here's an example. You're either going to spend money to prepare for global warming. Let's say you're committed environmentalist, or you just think we should push the economy forward and build new freeways. You're individualist. So then what happens in the future? Well, let's say it turns out that there's no global warming. As a hierarchist, you sort of wasted your money preparing for global warming. But if global warming hits, that's again the utopia for your situation, you only suffered minor damage because you prepared for it. Now conversely, if you were an individualist and you didn't think there was going to be global warming and there wasn't, well, you didn't waste your money and you have like a bunch of new freeways running around. But if global warming hits hard and there's a rise in sea level, your life could essentially be wrecked. You didn't prepare. You maybe built a bunch of new freeways along the border of Manhattan or the border of Florida, or you invested in a airport someplace in the South Sea Islands, and you're all underwater. So that's like a very bad outcome. Now in game theory, you'd have like what's your worst outcome and what's your middle outcome and what are your sort of best outcomes. You can analyze that and see what your strategy should be. And in this case, if you really don't know there's global warming or if there's not going to be global warming or global warming is going to have a big environmental impact, the best outcome, according to game theory, would be to assess which was the worst outcome and stay away from that. So if the worst outcome was to really waste a bunch of money on freeways, then you should find something other. Use your money that you prepared for global warming, but did in a way that sort of helped you out no matter what happened. Okay, now there's another way to look at these dystopias and utopias, which is this idea of a radar graph. And in the radar graph, let's look at 4 basic assumptions that are important, either individualist, hierarchist, or egalitarian. So individualists think nature is robust, it's going to bounce back, and innovation will always be supplied. And so their little triangle of activity shows this here, and if either nature turns out not to be robust or the innovations aren't supplied, then they're at risk in this area. If those underlying assumptions are made, this is going to cause them problems. If you're an egalitarian, you think cooperation is really important and maybe rules, maybe a little bit of rules are necessary. You sort of live in this area, and again, if it turns out that cooperation won't work, that puts you at risk, and you could have a dystopic future. And if you're a hierarchist, rules are necessary, but if it turns out they aren't necessary, again, then you could have this, it would be bad for you if it turns out rules were not necessary. The reason rules might not be necessary isn't that there aren't any rules, but that you spend a lot of time crafting specific rules, and those specific rules and incentives actually got in the way of either sort of a individualistic approach or a community approach that could have been a lot better. All right, I'm going to do one example of how this plays out, and then in the second half of the video, second part video, I'm going to talk about some examples using narratives and how we can discuss the future. So an example of how these worldviews might differ on climate change is here's 3 worldviews: hierarchist, egalitarian, individualist. Their view of nature is hierarchists think that CO2 would amplify the effect on temperature, but if you use the right incentives and rules, you could keep that under control. An egalitarian thinks there's strong amplification, but it's fragile, that it's really going to spin out of control. And an individualist thinks that really the world is well controlled. CO2 impact on temperature is just going to dampen out. There's going to be some mechanism that dampens that impact, and because really nature is resilient and robust. And what's interesting about this individualistic approach, which we now equate more with like capitalism and technology, is that when the Gaia hypothesis first came out, the people clung to used the Gaia hypothesis as an explanation of like how the world as an organism, according to that hypothesis, really had a lot of self-control mechanisms and was dampening, and that we could pollute the atmosphere and the oceans even more because Gaia hypothesis said it would bounce back. Well, that was sort of a misreading of what Lovelock was trying to get at, but in any case, it is one of the reasons why there's been some sort of switch. Now Gaia is the goddess essentially for egalitarian. That it's like a complex, delicate system, and that whole Earth's an organism. So it really is now much more equated with sort of an egalitarian worldview. Okay, well, let's look at some of the predictions from the underlying assumptions of these worldviews, which is, here's the prediction of what's going to happen with CO2 based on the upper line is hierarchist, the middle line is individualist, and the bottom line is egalitarian. So the hierarchist thinks CO2 is going to go up the most, and then individualist a little less, and the egalitarian thinks CO2 is going to be kept under control through egalitarian like cooperation. And then look at what they predict as temperature rises. Well, the hierarchist had the most CO2 rise, but sort of the medium impact on temperature. The individualist had the medium input on CO2, but very low temperature response, and this is because they think both technology and the nature itself is going to respond. And then finally, the hierarchist, the egalitarian, had the lowest CO2 rise, but the biggest increase in temperature. That's because they think the Earth system is essentially fragile. So if we look at this example for utopia dystopia, the worst situation is really this individualists who think, well, given this CO2 going up, and we're only going to see a little temperature rise. Well, if they're wrong, then they didn't prepare for it at all, and all of a sudden they're way up here with very high temperature increases for maybe even the same CO2 input. So this is, again, a way to look at what are the possible outcomes and use future extrapolations of what their worldviews mean, and then compare those and do the intercomparison. So you're not really saying which is right, is hierarchist, egalitarian, or individualist worldview right. You're comparing between the assumptions that they sort of self-selected. All right. Well, in part 2 of this lecture, I'm going to be talking about how we use narratives to generate scenarios, and I'm going to give 2 examples of scenarios, and we're going to talk about how we can use those to discuss the future.